They strung her up between the oaks as shooting target. The hunter said, "Touch her again, you're dead." Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now let's dive into the story. The sun was high above the vast, open plains, casting long shadows beneath the towering oaks. A soft breeze rustled through the leaves, but there was no comfort in the air today. Beneath the towering trees, a woman, her hands bound tightly to the rough bark, hung like a target in the middle of the clearing. Her body swayed gently with the wind, her breath shallow and strained, but the fear in her eyes was undeniable. She had been dragged here by the ruthless men who had held her captive for days. The punishment was clear, and the message was even clearer. She was to be the target in a twisted game of survival. Her heart pounded in her chest as the sound of boots on dry leaves reached her ears. The outlaws, men who had brought nothing but death and destruction, stood in a circle around her, eyes gleaming with anticipation. They were ready for their twisted sport. The plan was simple. They would take turns, firing their guns, testing their aim as they shot at her. Each bullet fired with precision, each shot meant to bring her closer to death. But she was not just a helpless victim. She was a woman who had seen the worst of the world and survived it. And she would not die today. As the first outlaw raised his gun, she closed her eyes, bracing herself for the inevitable. But then, a voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Touch her again, and you're dead." The words were spoken with such authority that even the hardened criminals froze, their eyes turning toward the figures standing at the edge of the clearing. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, with the aura of someone who had lived through countless battles and walked away unscathed. His expression was calm, but his eyes, sharp and unyielding, locked onto the outlaws. The man's gaze shifted to the woman who hung between the oaks, her face pale, her body trembling with fear. The outlaws hesitated, their weapons still in hand, unsure of how to proceed. The man's presence was imposing, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had made his own rules in a world that had none. "Let her go," he repeated, his tone unwavering. The leader of the outlaws, a burly man with a scar running down his cheek, sneered at the man. "And who the hell are you to tell us what to do?" he growled, his hand tightening around the handle of his revolver. The stranger didn't flinch. "I'm the one who's going to make sure you don't get to shoot her," he said simply, his hand moving slowly to the rifle slung over his shoulder. It was clear from the man's calm demeanor that he was not intimidated. The outlaws exchanged uneasy glances, but they weren't ready to back down just yet. They had a woman tied up between two trees, and they had every intention of using her as their target. But the stranger was different. His confidence was palpable, and the way he held himself suggested that he had faced men like these before and won. The outlaw leader, still unsure of the stranger's intentions, motioned for his men to lower their guns. "We'll see about this," he muttered, turning his gaze to the woman. But the hunter stepped forward, his rifle now aimed squarely at the leader. "You've had your fun," he said, his voice cold. "Now, it's time for you to leave." The leader of the outlaws stood frozen for a moment, his hand still resting on the revolver at his side. The tension in the air thickened, and the other men exchanged uncertain glances, unsure of how to react. The stranger, his rifle unwavering, took another step forward. He was a man who spoke little, but his presence spoke volumes. There was no fear in his eyes, no hesitation in his movements. He had made his decision. He would protect her. The leader of the outlaws, his face twisting into a sneer, finally broke the silence. "You think you can just waltz in here and take control?" he spat, his voice dripping with contempt. "You're outnumbered, old man. You don't stand a chance." The man's grip on the rifle tightened, but he didn't flinch. He was unbothered by the numbers, unbothered by the threats. His eyes remained fixed on the outlaw leader. "You'd be wise to leave now," the stranger said calmly, his voice carrying an unmistakable authority. The outlaw leader hesitated, then let out a low, menacing laugh. "You've got guts, I'll give you that," he said, taking a step toward the man, his hands twitching near his guns. "But guts won't save you from a bullet." The stranger's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. No, but you're about to find out what will, he replied. In one smooth motion, he swung his rifle to his side and fired. The sound of the shot rang through the clearing, the sharp crack of gunfire followed by the faint echo of leaves rustling in the wind. The bullet flew past the outlaw leader's ear, just grazing the side of his hat, sending it fluttering to the ground. The leader flinched, his eyes widening in disbelief. The others took a step back, their confidence suddenly shaken. The stranger didn't give them a chance to recover. "Get on your horses and get out of here," he ordered, his voice calm but firm. Now, for a moment, it seemed as if the outlaws might resist. But then the leader, his face a mixture of anger and fear, raised his hand. "This ain't over," he growled. "We'll come back for you. Mark my words." With that, he turned and stormed off, followed by his men, who were still eyeing the stranger warily. As they mounted their horses and rode off, the woman, still bound between the oak trees, let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She looked at the man who had saved her, still standing tall with his rifle in hand. He was a stranger to her, someone she had never met before, yet he had risked his life to protect her. He lowered his rifle, his eyes now softening as he turned toward her. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice gentle, yet filled with an underlying strength. She nodded slowly, still shaken from the ordeal. I think so," she replied, her voice shaky. "But I don't know what to say. You saved me." The stranger didn't respond immediately. He walked over to her, his movements calm and deliberate, then began to untie the ropes that held her to the trees. As he worked, he glanced at her, his face unreadable. "You don't owe me anything," he said quietly. "It's not about saving you. It's about doing what's right." When the ropes were finally undone, she sank to her knees, her legs trembling from the strain of being tied up for so long. She couldn't quite believe what had just happened. The outlaws had been so close to ending her life, and yet here she was, alive, thanks to a man who had come out of nowhere. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't come." The stranger helped her to her feet, his grip firm but kind. "You would have found a way," he said simply. "People always do." There was a long pause, and then he glanced around, as if assessing the situation. "We need to get you out of here," he said, his tone pragmatic. "It's not safe yet." He led her through the trees, toward the small cabin nestled at the edge of the woods, the one that had been his home for as long as he could remember. As they walked, the woman couldn't help but wonder who this man was, why he had come to her aid, and what his story was. But for now, all that mattered was that she was alive. Alive, and free from the clutches of the outlaws. The stranger paused at the door of the cabin, his eyes scanning the area one last time before he opened it and ushered her inside. "Rest here for now," he said. "I'll make sure you're safe." As she stepped inside, the warmth of the fire and the quiet of the cabin wrapped around her, and she felt a sense of calm she hadn't known in days. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, she felt like she had a chance. She sat down by the fire, her body exhausted but her heart filled with gratitude. The stranger had given her something no one else ever had: hope. The fire crackled softly in the corner of the small cabin, casting flickering shadows on the rough-hewn wooden walls. The woman sat close to the hearth, her hands still trembling from the ordeal she had just endured. Her body was sore, every muscle aching from the ropes and the harsh conditions she had been subjected to. She hadn't spoken much since the stranger had brought her in, too overwhelmed by everything that had happened. The man, who had saved her life, moved quietly around the cabin, his eyes constantly scanning the windows, his posture alert. He hadn't let his guard down since they had arrived, and she could see the weariness in his face, the years of hard living etched into his features. He had a quiet strength, the kind that came from surviving in a world where trust was scarce and danger was ever present. He paused for a moment, glancing at her. "You should rest," he said, his voice low but firm. "You're safe for now." The woman nodded, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. She had been given a temporary reprieve, but she knew that danger was still out there, lurking. "How did you find me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was just in the right place at the right time," the man replied, turning his attention back to the window. His tone was vague, as if he wasn't ready to share too much of his story just yet. The woman didn't press him further. She had learned not to ask too many questions, especially when it came to men like him. The ones who lived on the fringes of society, making their own rules and answering to no one. For now, she was just grateful for his help. He had risked his life to save her, and in doing so, had given her a chance to survive. The night wore on, and the silence in the cabin grew heavier. The wind howled outside, a reminder of the wild world beyond the walls. The stranger finally spoke again. "We can't stay here long," he said, his voice calm but resolute. "The outlaws won't give up that easily. They'll be back." The woman's heart sank. She had hoped, even for a moment, that she might be safe, but the reality was sinking in fast. "What do we do now?" she asked, the fear creeping back into her voice. "We leave at first light," the man said. "I know a place, a safe spot. We'll get you there, and then we'll figure out the rest." She wanted to protest, to ask more questions, but the look in his eyes stopped her. She could see the determination in them, the same kind of determination that had driven him to protect her earlier. This man was no stranger to danger, and she had to trust him if she wanted to survive. The woman spent the next few hours in a daze, her mind racing with thoughts of escape and survival. She had always known that life in the wilderness was unforgiving, but this was a new kind of danger. The outlaws who had tried to kill her were not the kind to give up easily. They would come back, and when they did, they would be more ruthless than ever. She glanced over at the man, who was still watching the door, his rifle resting against the wall next to him. He was ready, but she wasn't. She wasn't ready to leave everything behind, to abandon the life she had known. But there was no choice. She had to go. As the night stretched on, the wind grew colder, and the fire began to dwindle. The stranger stood up, his movements deliberate, and walked over to her. "Time to go," he said quietly. The woman stood up, her legs unsteady beneath her. She had never been so scared in her life, but something in his eyes gave her the strength to move. She nodded, following him as he opened the door and stepped into the night. The cold air hit her like a slap in the face, but it also made her feel alive. She followed the stranger into the wilderness, her heart pounding in her chest, but there was no turning back now. This was her only chance, and she had to take it. They walked for miles, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the soft earth beneath them. The stranger led the way, his senses sharp, always alert. The woman kept close, not knowing where they were going, but trusting him all the same. It wasn't until the sky began to lighten that they reached their destination, a small cave hidden deep in the woods. The stranger motioned for her to enter first. "It's not much, but it's safe," he said. She stepped inside, the cool air of the cave a welcome relief from the biting wind. She looked around at the sparse surroundings, but it felt like a sanctuary. The man followed her inside, closing the entrance behind them. "We'll stay here for a while," he said, his voice softer now. "Get some rest. We'll figure out the next move in the morning." The woman sat down on the cold ground, exhaustion hitting her all at once. She had made it through another night, and she knew there would be more to come. But for now, she was safe. And with that thought, she closed her eyes, allowing herself to finally rest. The danger wasn't gone, but for the first time in a long while, she felt like she had a chance. The morning light filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the small cave where the woman sat. She had barely slept through the night, her mind racing with thoughts of the danger they had narrowly escaped and the uncertainty of what was to come. The stranger, who had saved her life more than once now, sat quietly near the entrance, his rifle resting on the ground beside him. He had not spoken much since they arrived at the cave, his focus entirely on the surroundings, as if he was waiting for something. The woman shifted uncomfortably, her body sore from the strain of the past few days. She glanced over at the man, wondering how he could remain so calm in the face of the chaos that surrounded them. She had seen men like him before, quiet, strong, and dangerous, but she could never quite understand them. He seemed to live in a world of his own, a world where emotions didn't have a place, and survival was the only rule. As the sun rose higher, the man stood up and stretched. "We need to move," he said, his voice low and steady. The woman didn't question him. She had learned quickly that he was always right. She nodded, rising to her feet as she followed him out of the cave. The cold morning air hit her face, but it didn't bother her as much as it had the night before. Her body was growing used to the harsh conditions, and she was beginning to feel stronger. The stranger led her through the woods, his movements swift and precise. He didn't speak much, but his presence was enough to make her feel safe. She could sense that he was always alert, always watching for any sign of danger. She had no idea where they were headed, but she trusted him. They walked for hours, the sounds of the forest surrounding them, until they came to a small creek. The stranger paused, kneeling beside the water and drinking from it. "We'll rest here for a while," he said, gesturing to the water. The woman sat down on a nearby rock, her legs aching from the long walk. She didn't ask any questions, didn't try to understand his plan. She just knew that, for now, this was their only chance. The stranger's eyes scanned the horizon as he sat beside her, his rifle close by. He had been through this kind of life before, always moving, always staying one step ahead of the danger. It was clear to her now that he was a man who had lived by his own code, a code that valued survival above all else. As the hours passed, the woman couldn't help but wonder about the man's past. He had saved her without question, without hesitation, but she knew nothing about him. Who was he? Why was he out here in the wilderness alone? The questions swirled in her mind, but she didn't ask. She knew better than to pry. Instead, she watched the stranger, noting the way his eyes never stopped moving, the way he always seemed ready to act. She felt a strange sense of calm wash over her. She was no longer just a victim, no longer just a woman at the mercy of the world. She was part of something, part of a story that was still being written. The stranger turned to her after a long silence, his gaze softening slightly. "You're safe for now," he said. "But we can't stay here long. The outlaws will be looking for us, and they won't stop until they find us." The woman nodded, her heart sinking at the thought of what was to come. She had hoped for a moment of peace, but she knew it was fleeting. They couldn't afford to stay in one place for too long. As the sun began to set, the stranger rose, his movements fluid and deliberate. "We'll keep moving," he said. "I have a place in mind, a place where we can hide for a while." The woman stood up, feeling the weight of the decision settle in her chest. She had no choice but to trust him. He had saved her life, and he was offering her another chance. She had to take it. Together, they walked deeper into the woods, the shadows of the trees stretching long across the path ahead. She didn't know where they were going, but she knew one thing: they weren't safe yet. And as much as she wanted to believe they were, the reality was clear. The outlaws were still out there, and they would stop at nothing to find her. The woman's mind raced with the possibilities. Would they make it to safety? Or would the strangers who had captured her before find them, ending the fragile hope she had left? But there was something in the stranger's eyes, something that told her they had a chance. They had a chance to survive, to escape the past, and to start over. And that was enough to keep her moving forward, step by step, toward an uncertain future. The hours passed as they moved through the woods, the sun slowly sinking behind the horizon. The stranger led the way, his steps sure and steady, while the woman followed behind, doing her best to keep up with his pace. Her body still ached from the previous days of travel, but the fear of being caught kept her moving, one foot in front of the other. They didn't speak much as they walked, both too focused on the task at hand. The air was thick with the sounds of the forest, the rustling of leaves, the occasional snap of a twig underfoot, but it was the silence between them that felt the heaviest. She had come to realize just how little she knew about the man who had saved her life. His past was a mystery, a story he wasn't ready to share, and perhaps one he couldn't. But his presence was a comfort. The way he moved, the way he carried himself, it was clear he had seen his fair share of violence, and yet he didn't seem broken by it. He was like a force of nature, calm but relentless, always a step ahead of the danger. As they made their way deeper into the woods, the woman couldn't help but wonder how long they could keep this up. The outlaws had to be searching for them, and it wouldn't be long before they caught up. The thought made her stomach twist. She couldn't bear the idea of going through another round of torture, of being at the mercy of those men. But the stranger had promised her safety, and for now, that was enough. He had led them through the wilderness for hours, and the night was beginning to settle in. The woman's legs were sore, and the darkness was closing in fast. She could feel the chill in the air, the kind of cold that settled deep into the bones, and she knew they couldn't keep walking much longer. The stranger stopped abruptly, turning to face her. "We'll set up camp here," he said quietly. "It's not much, but it'll do for the night." The woman looked around, seeing only the dense trees and the darkening sky above. There was no sign of danger yet, but she knew that could change at any moment. They weren't safe, not really. The stranger moved quickly, gathering dry branches and setting up a small fire. It wasn't much, but it would give them some warmth and light. The woman sat down beside him, wrapping her arms around herself to ward off the cold. Her thoughts were a whirlwind, the danger of the situation hanging over her like a cloud. "We need to keep moving at first light," the stranger said, his voice low. "The outlaws won't stop. They'll come for us." The woman nodded, though her mind was elsewhere. The prospect of being on the run forever felt unbearable, but she had no choice. As long as the stranger was with her, she had a chance. But even he couldn't protect her forever. "What happens if they find us?" she asked, her voice shaky. "What then?" The stranger didn't answer immediately. Instead, he kept his eyes on the fire, his face illuminated by the flickering flames. "Then we fight," he said finally, his voice calm but resolute. "We fight to survive." His words hit her harder than she expected. She had never been one for fighting, never imagined herself in a position where survival meant facing down men who would kill without a second thought. But she knew in that moment that she had no other choice. She had to survive. She had to fight. The night stretched on, the fire crackling between them, but the silence was almost unbearable. She could feel the weight of his gaze on her, and for the first time, she wondered what his story was. Who was he really? What kind of man was willing to risk everything for a woman he didn't even know? But as the hours passed and the sounds of the wilderness began to fade into the background, she realized it didn't matter. They were in this together, for better or worse. As the fire burned low, the stranger stood up, brushing the dirt from his clothes. "Get some sleep," he said. "We'll leave at dawn." The woman nodded, though sleep was a distant thought. Her mind raced with possibilities. What if the outlaws found them before they could escape? What if they were caught? But there was no point in worrying about things they couldn't control. They had survived this long. She had to trust that they would make it through whatever came next. She closed her eyes, her body exhausted, her thoughts a whirlwind of fear and hope. Tomorrow would come, and with it, the next step in their journey. But for now, she let the warmth of the fire lull her into a restless sleep, knowing that no matter what happened, she would keep fighting. The stranger had given her that much, hope. And with hope, there was always a chance. The first rays of dawn crept through the trees, casting a faint light on the forest floor. The woman woke to the sound of the stranger moving quietly around the camp, his actions practiced and deliberate. The fire had died down to embers, and the air was colder than it had been the night before. Her body was sore, her muscles stiff from the constant movement, but she knew there was no time to waste. The stranger was already packing their things, his rifle slung over his shoulder, his eyes scanning the woods with the same watchful alertness she had come to expect from him. She stood up slowly, stretching her legs, and walked over to where he was gathering their gear. "We're moving out," he said without looking at her. "The outlaws will be close, and we can't stay here for long." The woman nodded, not bothering to question him. She had learned to trust him in the short time they had been together. There was no other choice. They had to keep moving. As they left their camp behind, the forest seemed to come alive with the sounds of the morning. Birds chirped in the trees, and the occasional rustle of animals in the underbrush reminded her that they weren't alone. The woman kept close behind the stranger, her steps quick but careful. The pace was grueling, but she pushed herself to keep up. It wasn't just the physical exhaustion that weighed on her. It was the constant worry about what lay ahead. She had been in danger before, but this felt different. The outlaws weren't just after her. They were after both of them. And the stranger had made it clear that if they were caught, there would be no mercy. After hours of travel, they stopped at the edge of a small ravine, the stranger's sharp eyes scanning the area. "We'll rest here for a moment," he said, his voice calm, but with an edge of urgency. The woman looked around. It wasn't much, just a small patch of ground surrounded by trees, but it was better than nothing. She sat down on a nearby rock, rubbing her hands together to warm them. "How much further?" she asked, her voice hoarse from the long walk. "We'll make it to the next place by nightfall," the stranger replied. "It's a small cabin. We'll lay low there for a while, regroup, and figure out our next move." She wanted to ask more questions, to press him for details, but she didn't. He had already given her more than she expected, and she knew it was pointless to ask about things he wasn't ready to share. She looked up at him, studying his face. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, a quiet intensity that spoke volumes. She had no idea who he was or what he had been through, but in that moment, she realized it didn't matter. He had already shown her the kind of person he was, someone willing to fight for survival, even when the odds were stacked against them. They sat in silence for a while, both of them lost in their own thoughts. The woman's mind kept drifting back to the outlaws, to the men who had almost killed her. She had never been the type to get involved in violence, but now, it felt like it was the only thing that could keep her alive. She thought about what the stranger had said. We fight to survive. She didn't know if she could be the kind of person who fought back, who did what it took to protect herself. But one thing was certain, she didn't want to die. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, the stranger stood up, motioning for her to follow. "Time to go," he said, his voice steady. The woman nodded, pushing herself to her feet. The fear she had felt earlier was still there, lingering at the edges of her thoughts, but it wasn't as strong as it had been. She felt a strange sense of determination taking its place. They had made it this far, and if they kept moving, kept fighting, they might just make it out of this alive. They set off again, the stranger leading the way with confidence, and the woman following, her steps growing steadier with each passing mile. As the day wore on, they passed through dense forests, crossed small streams, and navigated rugged terrain. The woman's legs ached, but she didn't complain. She knew the stranger was keeping pace for both of them, always looking out for danger, always staying one step ahead. It wasn't until the sun began to set that they reached the cabin. It was small, built into the side of a hill, and surrounded by trees. It looked abandoned, but the stranger didn't hesitate. He approached the door, his rifle raised, and pushed it open slowly. The interior was dim, the air thick with dust, and the smell of old wood. There was a fireplace on one wall, a small table with chairs, and a bed in the corner. "We'll stay here for the night," the stranger said, his voice low. "Get some rest. We'll leave before dawn." The woman nodded, grateful for the shelter. She was exhausted, both physically and emotionally, and the thought of finally having a moment of peace was a welcome relief. She sat down on the bed, her eyes closing for just a moment, and then, as if on cue, the sound of distant hooves reached her ears. The woman's eyes snapped open. "They're coming," she whispered. The stranger was already moving, his rifle back in hand, his eyes scanning the darkness outside. "Stay quiet," he said, his voice a low growl. "We're not done yet." The sound of hooves grew louder, cutting through the stillness of the night like a creeping shadow. The stranger moved quickly, his eyes scanning the dim interior of the cabin, his rifle steady in his hands. "Stay quiet," he whispered urgently, his voice barely audible over the pounding of his heart. The woman pressed herself into the corner, holding her breath as the distant noise grew closer. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her, the fear creeping back into her chest. She wanted to ask him what they would do if they were found, but she knew better than to speak. The stranger had already made it clear. Silence was their only chance. The hooves were almost upon them now, and she could hear the faint murmur of voices outside. The outlaws were closing in. Her mind raced as she glanced toward the door. They had to get out, but how? The stranger moved to the window, peering through the cracks in the wooden boards. His gaze was sharp, scanning the surroundings with the precision of a man who had lived through countless close calls. "They're here," he said quietly. "Stay low, stay silent." The woman nodded, her body tense with fear, her heart thudding in her chest. She had never felt so vulnerable. She had no idea who these men were, but they were ruthless, and she had no doubt that if they found her, she wouldn't survive. The cabin seemed to shrink around her, the walls pressing in as the voices outside grew louder. The stranger moved swiftly, his movements smooth and calculated. "If they come inside, we fight," he said in a low voice, his tone calm, but there was a fire in his eyes. The woman didn't speak. There was no time for questions now. They had to survive, and it was clear that the stranger was prepared to do whatever it took. The sounds of the outlaws grew louder, their footsteps heavy on the ground as they approached the cabin. The woman held her breath, her heart in her throat. She could hear their laughter, the sound of men who thought they were in control, who thought they had the upper hand. The stranger's eyes narrowed as he glanced toward the door, and for a moment, she saw something in his expression, something that spoke of a life lived in the shadows, a life spent fighting for survival. He wasn't just a man trying to protect her. He was someone who had seen the worst of the world and had come out the other side. She wondered what had brought him to this point, what kind of life he had lived, but she didn't dare ask. She wasn't sure she wanted to know. As the footsteps grew louder, the stranger moved to the back of the cabin, positioning himself in the shadows. The woman followed his lead, crouching low to the ground. Every muscle in her body was coiled with tension, every nerve on edge. She could hear the outlaws talking now, their words clear as they circled the cabin. "This is it," one of them said. "The tracks lead right here. Search the cabin." Another voice responded. "She can't be far." The woman's blood ran cold. They were here for her. The stranger moved silently beside her, his rifle ready. "Stay still," he mouthed. The woman nodded, gripping the edge of the table as she braced herself for whatever would come next. The outlaws' voices grew louder as they reached the cabin, their footsteps heavy on the wooden floor outside. She could hear them testing the door, their hands scraping across the rough wood as they tried to force it open. The silence inside the cabin was suffocating. The woman's breath came in short gasps, her eyes darting between the door and the stranger, who remained perfectly still. He was waiting for the right moment. The door creaked under the pressure, and the woman's heart skipped a beat. The outlaws were getting closer, and there was no more time. The stranger's fingers tightened on his rifle, his muscles coiled and ready to strike. The woman's mind raced. They had one chance to get out alive. If they didn't act soon, they would be trapped. She could feel the weight of the decision pressing on her. She wasn't ready to fight. She wasn't ready to die, but she didn't have a choice. The door burst open with a sudden crash, and the outlaws stormed inside, guns drawn. The woman barely had time to react before the stranger lunged forward, his rifle swinging into position. The first outlaw didn't even see him coming. With a swift, practiced motion, the stranger knocked the man's gun away and disarmed him in one fluid move. The woman's heart pounded as the chaos unfolded around her. The stranger moved with precision, his movements like a well-oiled machine. But she wasn't just watching him. She had to act. Without thinking, she grabbed a nearby piece of wood and swung it at the closest outlaw, knocking him off balance. The man cursed, stumbling back, but he recovered quickly. A second outlaw rushed toward her, but before he could reach her, the stranger was there. He tackled the man to the ground with a powerful shove, pinning him down. "Run," he shouted to her. "Get out." The woman hesitated for a split second, but then she bolted for the door. The outlaws were still distracted, their focus on the stranger. She sprinted through the open door, her heart racing as she ran into the woods. She didn't look back. She couldn't. She had to survive. The sound of gunshots rang out behind her, but she kept running, faster than she ever had before. The woman didn't know where she was going, but she knew she had to keep moving. The stranger had given her a chance, and she wasn't about to waste it. She ran as fast as her legs would carry her, her lungs burning with every breath. She didn't know how long she ran or where she was going, but the one thing she knew for sure was that she couldn't stop. She couldn't slow down. She had to live. She had to make it. The sound of the forest filled her ears, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to hope. She wasn't alone anymore. She was free. And for now, that was enough. The woman ran through the thick underbrush, her breath ragged and her heart pounding in her chest. Every step she took was a gamble. Each branch she brushed against, each snap of a twig beneath her feet, felt like it might give her away. But she couldn't stop. She couldn't afford to stop. The sounds of gunfire and shouting from behind her still echoed in the distance, a reminder of how close the danger was. The outlaws hadn't given up, and the stranger, her protector, was still behind, trying to hold them off long enough for her to escape. She didn't know where she was going, just that she had to keep moving. She had to survive. The forest around her seemed endless, the trees stretching high above, their leaves rustling in the wind. The path she was following was narrow, overgrown with vines and thorns, but it was all she had. She pushed through, her hands stinging from the branches she shoved aside, her legs burning with fatigue. It felt like hours since she had started running, but she knew she couldn't stop. Not now. Not when the stakes were so high. As she pushed on, the sounds of the forest began to fade, replaced by the deafening thud of her own heartbeat in her ears. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the ground, and she knew that nightfall would only make things worse. She needed shelter. She needed to hide. The woman glanced over her shoulder, but there was no sign of the outlaws. The stranger had managed to slow them down, but how long would it be before they regrouped and came after her again? Panic began to creep into her thoughts, but she pushed it aside. She had to stay focused. She had to keep moving forward. She spotted a small clearing ahead, a break in the trees where the ground was softer, less covered by brush. Her legs screamed for rest, but she forced herself to move faster, her mind set on reaching the clearing. When she finally reached it, she collapsed to her knees, gasping for breath. The world spun around her as she struggled to steady herself. She looked up and saw a small, abandoned cabin in the distance, barely visible through the trees. It was her only hope. She pushed herself to her feet, ignoring the sharp pain in her side, and staggered toward the cabin. The door creaked as she pushed it open, the scent of dust and stale air filling her lungs. The cabin was empty, but it was a roof over her head, and for now, that was enough. She bolted the door behind her, leaning against it for support. Her heart was still racing, her body trembling with exhaustion, but she was safe for the moment. The sounds of pursuit had faded, and for the first time in hours, she allowed herself a moment of relief. She sat down on the floor, her back against the cold, wooden wall, and closed her eyes. She was alive, but she knew it wouldn't last long. The outlaws would come. They would always come. Her mind went back to the stranger. He had saved her. He had given her this chance, this fleeting moment of safety. But he hadn't followed her. Had he been caught? Was he? The thought made her stomach tighten, but she pushed it away. She couldn't afford to think like that. Not now. She had to focus on getting out of here, on surviving. She glanced around the cabin, looking for anything that could help her. There was a fireplace, but no wood. A small cot in the corner, but no blanket. A couple of rickety chairs, a table, and a few shelves with old cans and dried herbs. Nothing useful. She ran her hands through her hair, frustrated. But then a thought struck her. She needed to make a plan. The stranger had said they would leave before dawn. That meant she had to be ready to go. She couldn't stay here, not with the outlaws likely closing in. She would have to move again. She needed to find a way to survive, to escape, to get out of the wilderness and find safety. The sun was almost completely gone now, and the darkness of the forest pressed in around her. She moved to the window, pulling the dusty curtains aside just enough to peek through. The woods were quiet now, but she knew better than to trust that silence. The outlaws would be out there, hunting for her, but she couldn't stay put forever. She had to keep moving. A noise in the distance caught her attention. Footsteps, faint but unmistakable. The sound made her freeze, her heart skipping a beat. She wasn't alone. Someone was out there. She quickly moved away from the window, her mind racing. The stranger had told her to stay quiet, to keep her head down. And now, more than ever, she had to do just that. She crouched down low, hiding behind the old wooden table, her hand resting on the rough surface as she waited. The sound of footsteps grew louder. Whoever it was, they were getting closer. She could hear them now, murmuring voices, but she couldn't make out what they were saying. They were too close. Her pulse quickened, and she instinctively reached for the small knife she had found in the cabin, holding it tightly in her hand. She wasn't a fighter. She wasn't even sure she could defend herself, but she wasn't going down without a fight. She would survive. She had to. The door creaked, and the woman's breath caught in her throat. The figure outside had reached the cabin. She held her breath, waiting, praying they wouldn't hear her. The footsteps stopped, and for a long moment, there was silence. Her heart pounded in her chest as she tried to stay as still as possible. And then, the door opened. The woman braced herself, knife in hand, ready to face whatever came through that door. The door creaked open slowly, the faint light of the moon spilling into the cabin. The woman's grip on the knife tightened, her breath shallow as she braced for what was to come. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, each beat like a drum urging her to act, to do whatever it took to survive. She wasn't ready for a fight, but she had no choice. She had made it this far, and she wasn't going to let the outlaws take her now. The door swung fully open, and in the dim light, a figure stepped into the cabin. The woman's eyes widened, her body tensing in anticipation. But then, the figure spoke, and her heart skipped a beat. "It's me." The stranger's voice was low, familiar. "Don't move." Relief washed over her like a wave, but she didn't lower the knife. Her instincts screamed at her to be cautious. The last thing she wanted was to trust anyone too quickly. She couldn't afford to be wrong. The stranger stepped further into the cabin, his face half lit by the moonlight that filtered through the window. "You thought I was one of them, didn't you?" he asked, his tone almost amused. She didn't answer, but the tension in her body was slowly starting to melt. "You've got the knife," he said, nodding toward her hand. "Good. Better safe than sorry. But we're not out of the woods yet." His eyes scanned the room, and then he turned back to her. "The outlaws are closing in on us. We need to move, now." The woman slowly lowered the knife, her hand still trembling from the adrenaline coursing through her veins. She had no choice. He was right. The danger wasn't over. "I thought you were," she began, but her voice trailed off. She didn't want to say it out loud. She had thought he had been caught, or worse. But now he was here, and they still had a chance. He cut her off before she could finish. "I know. It's been close. But we can't stay here any longer. They're not far behind. We have to go." His words brought her back to reality. She didn't have the luxury of thinking too much. She had to act. She nodded, standing up, her legs shaky but determined. The stranger turned and headed toward the door, but then stopped, looking back at her. "Are you ready?" he asked. She wasn't sure if she was ready, but she knew she had no other choice. "Yes," she said, her voice firm. The stranger nodded and led the way out into the night. The woman followed closely behind, her eyes darting around as the sounds of the forest surrounded them. The air was thick with tension, and every shadow felt like a threat. They moved quickly, staying close to the trees, their footsteps light as they navigated the rugged terrain. The woman's heart was racing again, but this time it was different. She wasn't running from the past. She was moving toward something. She was moving toward survival. As they walked, the stranger didn't speak much, his focus entirely on the path ahead. The woman didn't mind. She didn't need to know everything about him right now. She just needed to stay alive, and he was her best shot at that. They continued walking for what felt like hours, the darkness growing thicker around them. The woman's legs were sore, and her breath came in short gasps, but she kept moving, pushing herself forward. They couldn't stop. Not yet. Eventually, they reached a small clearing, and the stranger paused. He looked around cautiously, his eyes scanning the trees. "We'll rest here for a bit," he said quietly. "But we can't stay long." The woman nodded, grateful for a moment to catch her breath. She sank down to the ground, her body aching from the constant movement. The stranger kept watch, his rifle ready. The night was eerily silent, and for a moment, it almost felt like they were safe. But the woman knew better. The outlaws were still out there, and they weren't going to stop until they had her. She glanced up at the stranger, wondering what had driven him to help her. What kind of man was he? But again, she didn't ask. There wasn't time for questions. She couldn't afford to waste time wondering about him. She had to focus on surviving. The stranger crouched down beside her, his eyes never leaving the edge of the clearing. "I'm not sure how much longer we can keep running," he said, his voice low. "Eventually, they'll catch up." The woman nodded, her stomach tightening at the thought. She didn't want to die, not like this. But she wasn't going to give up. She had come this far. "What do we do now?" she asked. The stranger looked at her, his expression unreadable. "We fight," he said simply. "We keep moving, keep fighting, and we'll find a way out." She wasn't sure if she believed him, but she had no other choice but to trust him. They had made it this far together, and if they were going to survive, they would have to stick together. As the night dragged on, they sat in silence, each of them lost in their own thoughts. The woman didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to let the outlaws take her without a fight. She would survive, and she would make it out of this, no matter what it took. The night seemed to stretch endlessly as the woman and the stranger remained in the clearing, their eyes scanning the surrounding forest for any sign of danger. The silence was oppressive, only broken by the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. The woman could feel the weight of the stranger's words hanging in the air. "We fight star." It wasn't a promise, just a statement of fact. But it was enough. She had no illusions about what was coming. The outlaws would find them, and when they did, there would be no mercy. She had seen that in their eyes when they had captured her, when they had dragged her into the woods as their prize. But that was before the stranger had come. He had given her a chance, a fleeting hope that they could escape. She wasn't ready to give that up just yet. As the hours ticked by, the woman's exhaustion began to catch up with her. Her muscles ached, and her mind was clouded by the fear of what lay ahead. She glanced over at the stranger, who had been staring into the darkness, his face shadowed by the flickering light of the small fire they had made. He seemed so calm, so composed, and yet she could sense the same fear she felt, buried beneath the surface. He had a past, a history he wasn't ready to share, but it didn't matter. He was here now, and for as long as they were together, they would fight. How much longer? She asked, her voice hoarse. The stranger didn't turn to look at her, but his eyes shifted, scanning the perimeter. Not long, he said quietly. They'll be here soon. The woman nodded, though she wasn't sure what to expect. She had heard the stories, the rumors of what the outlaws were capable of. They didn't care about laws, about morals. They took what they wanted, and if anyone got in their way, they killed them without a second thought. The woman knew she wouldn't survive if it came to that. She had no weapons, no way to defend herself, but she had the stranger. She had to believe that he could protect her. But as the minutes dragged on, the fear in her heart grew stronger. The fire crackled in the silence, the only sound breaking the stillness. Her mind raced with thoughts of escape, of running, but there was nowhere to go. She had no idea how far they had traveled, but the woods seemed endless, and the outlaws were closing in. The woman swallowed hard, trying to push the fear down. She had to stay strong. She had to be ready. The stranger turned to her suddenly, his eyes intense. When they come, he said, don't hesitate. Don't wait for me to tell you what to do. Run, as fast as you can. The woman's heart skipped a beat. Run. The word echoed in her mind, but it didn't make sense. She couldn't just leave him behind. She couldn't leave him to face the outlaws alone. What about you? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I'll hold them off, he said, his tone calm but firm. Just make sure you get away. The woman wanted to protest, to argue, but she knew it was pointless. He had made up his mind. There was no other way. She had to run. She had to survive. The sound of horses in the distance made her stomach drop. The outlaws were coming. The stranger moved. Swiftly, his body tense, his rifle at the ready. Stay behind me, he said, as he stepped toward the edge of the clearing. The woman did as he instructed, her body shaking with fear. She knew that once the outlaws arrived, there would be no going back. This was it. This was their fight for survival. She could hear the hooves growing louder, the sound of the outlaws closing in, their voices cutting through the air. They were almost here. The woman's heart raced as she watched the stranger, who stood silently, his posture perfect, his rifle aimed at the approaching danger. She had never seen anyone so calm under pressure. The outlaws broke through the trees, their figures emerging from the darkness, their faces twisted with malice. They had found them. The woman's breath caught in her throat as she took a step back, instinctively retreating into the shadows. She could see the anger in their eyes, the hunger for violence that radiated off them. The stranger didn't move. He stood his ground, unwavering. You've made a mistake, he said, his voice low, but filled with authority. Leave now, and I'll let you walk away. The outlaws laughed, the sound harsh and mocking. You're outnumbered, old man. One of them sneered. You really think you can take us all on? The stranger's eyes narrowed, his finger tightening on the rifle. Try me, he said coldly. The outlaws didn't hesitate. One of them lunged forward, his knife raised, but the stranger was faster. In one fluid motion, he sidestepped and shot the man in the leg. The outlaw screamed, collapsing to the ground. The others hesitated, momentarily stunned by the speed of the attack. But then, as if on cue, they charged, guns raised. The woman's heart raced as she watched the stranger move with precision, taking down one outlaw after another, his movements a blur of skill and experience. But it wasn't enough. The outlaws were too many, and they were closing in fast. Run, the stranger shouted. Go. The woman didn't hesitate. She turned and ran as fast as she could, her feet pounding against the earth, her lungs burning with each breath. She couldn't look back. She couldn't waste a second. The stranger had given her a chance. Now, it was up to her to take it. The woman ran as fast as she could, her breath coming in short, frantic gasps. The sounds of the outlaws' shouts and gunfire still echoed in her mind, but she didn't dare look back. Her legs burned, her body screamed for rest, but there was no time for that. She had to keep running. She had to survive. The stranger had given her the chance she needed, and now she had to take it. The path through the woods was rough, the ground uneven, and the branches and thorns that snagged at her clothes only made the journey harder. But she pushed through, her eyes fixed ahead, her focus solely on the escape. She could hear the distant thud of hooves pounding the earth, growing louder with each passing second. They were coming after her, and they wouldn't stop until they had her. She had no doubt of that. Her heart raced in her chest, a mixture of fear and adrenaline fueling her every step. Her thoughts were scattered, her mind barely able to process what was happening. All she knew was that she had to get away. She didn't look back, but she could feel the weight of the danger closing in. The stranger's words echoed in her mind. Run. As fast as you can. She was doing just that, but her legs were beginning to slow. The fear, the exhaustion, and the relentless pace were taking their toll. She stumbled, her foot catching on a root, but she quickly righted herself, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She had to keep moving. The sounds of the hooves were now nearly deafening, and the woman could feel her pulse in her ears, the thudding of her heart matching the rhythm of the galloping horses. She had no idea how far ahead of them she was, but she had to hope it was enough. Her eyes scanned the forest, looking for any sign of a path, any sign of a way out. The trees were dense, and the moonlight barely pierced the canopy above, making it difficult to see. But then, through the darkness, she saw a flicker of light in the distance. A campfire. Her heart skipped a beat. It wasn't much, but it was a chance. She pushed herself harder, moving toward the light, praying that it wasn't another trap. As she neared the fire, she saw figures in the distance. 3 men, their silhouettes outlined by the glow. They didn't seem to notice her approach, too focused on the fire in front of them. The woman took a deep breath, steadying herself for what was to come. She wasn't sure what she was going to do, but she knew she had to do something. She couldn't let them catch her. She crept closer, moving silently, her body still trembling with fear and exhaustion. The outlaws would be here any minute, and if she was going to survive, she needed help. She needed a plan. As she got closer, she could hear the men talking, their voices low and rough. She couldn't make out the words, but it was clear that they weren't out here looking for a fight. She hesitated, her hand still gripping the knife she had taken from the cabin. She could feel the weight of it, but she didn't want to use it, not unless she had to. She could feel the heat from the fire now, and the faces of the men were more visible. They looked rough, but they didn't seem like the outlaws who had been chasing her. They weren't wearing the same kind of gear, and they didn't have that dangerous, predatory look in their eyes. They were just men, tired from the road, maybe even hungry. One of them looked up, his eyes scanning the woods. The woman froze, her breath caught in her throat. Had he seen her? But the man just turned back to the fire, not noticing her at all. She breathed a silent sigh of relief. She couldn't believe her luck. She was close now, just a few feet away. She could make a move, ask for help, or she could keep running. But she had to decide quickly. The sounds of the hooves were growing louder again, and her window of opportunity was closing fast. She took a deep breath and made her choice. She stepped into the firelight, her heart hammering in her chest, but her voice steady. "Please," she said, her voice low but urgent. "You have to help me. They're coming. They'll kill me if they catch me." The men froze, their eyes widening in surprise at the sudden appearance of the woman. They looked at each other, unsure of what to make of her. But the one who had first noticed her finally stood up, his expression hardening. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice low and cautious. The woman's heart raced. She didn't have time for explanations, for asking questions. "Please," she repeated, her voice trembling now. "I don't know who you are, but I'm begging you. They're coming for me. They'll kill me if they find me." The man studied her for a moment, his gaze cold and calculating, but then his expression softened just a little. "All right," he said, nodding toward the others. "We'll hide you, but you've got to keep quiet. And you'd better pray they don't find us." The woman didn't hesitate. She stepped forward, her heart pounding with a mix of hope and fear. She didn't know who these men were, but they were her chance. Her only chance. As the men began to make preparations, she sank to her knees by the fire, feeling the heat on her skin, her breath still coming in short gasps. She had made it this far. But now, the real fight was about to begin. The woman sat by the fire, her body trembling as the heat from the flames washed over her. She had never been more aware of her own vulnerability. She had escaped the outlaws, but she wasn't free yet. The sounds of their pursuit still echoed in her mind, the threat of death ever present. As the men began to prepare their camp, she watched them closely, trying to gauge whether they were truly helping her or if they had their own plans. The fire crackled in the silence, and the woman's mind raced. She had been running for so long, surviving on instinct and fear, but now, she had to think. The men had agreed to help her, but she couldn't afford to be naive. She had no idea who they were or what they wanted, but for now, they were her best chance. She had to stay alive. She had to survive. One of the men, the one who had spoken to her earlier, moved toward her. His face was rugged, his clothes worn from days in the wilderness. His eyes were hard, but there was something in them, something that hinted at experience, at a life lived on the edge. "You're lucky we found you," he said, his voice low. "The outlaws are getting bolder. They're not just after you. They'll do anything to get what they want." The woman nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She had learned not to reveal too much, not to give away anything that might make her more of a target. She didn't know if this man's words were meant to reassure her or to remind her of the danger they were in. "Where are you going?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The man didn't hesitate. "We're heading east. There's a settlement there, a place where we can rest, regroup. But we have to be careful. The outlaws have spread out. They'll be looking for you. Looking for us." The woman's heart skipped a beat. She had heard of the settlements to the east, but she didn't know if they were safe. She didn't know if anything was safe anymore. "How do you know they won't find us?" she asked, her voice tinged with doubt. "We've been hiding from them for a while," he replied. "We know how to move without being seen, but we can't take too many risks. If we're spotted, we're done." The woman's mind raced. She didn't want to trust these men completely, but she didn't have a choice. She had to believe that they were her best shot at survival. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady, though she could feel the weight of the words. She didn't know if they could be trusted, but for now, it was all she had. The man gave a short nod, then turned back to the fire. The other men were finishing their preparations, gathering what little they had. They didn't speak much, their faces grim as they worked. The woman couldn't help but wonder what had brought them here, what their lives had been like before they had crossed paths with her. She didn't ask. There wasn't time for questions. They were leaving in the morning, and she needed to be ready. The night passed in uneasy silence. The woman lay awake, listening to the sounds of the forest around her. She was used to the quiet of the wilderness, but tonight it felt different. The air was thick with tension, the stillness hiding the threat of danger. The fire burned low, casting flickering shadows on the walls of the small shelter. The men didn't sleep much, their eyes always alert, always watching. She wondered if they were just as afraid as she was, but they didn't show it. They were survivors, and they were playing a game she didn't fully understand. The hours seemed to stretch on endlessly, but finally, the first light of dawn broke through the trees. The men began to stir, preparing to move. The woman stood up, her body stiff from the cold ground, but there was no time to waste. They had to keep moving. She took one last look at the fire, then followed the men as they made their way into the forest. The path was rough, the underbrush thick, but they moved quickly, silently, as if they had done this 1,000 times before. The woman stayed close behind, her eyes constantly scanning the woods for any sign of the outlaws. The stranger's words from the night before echoed in her mind. "We fight to survive star." She wasn't sure if she was ready to fight, but she knew she had no other choice. The group moved through the forest for hours, the sounds of the wilderness filling the silence. The men didn't speak much, their focus solely on the journey ahead. The woman kept her thoughts to herself, her mind a whirlwind of fear and uncertainty. She had been running for so long, and yet, she had never felt more trapped. As the sun reached its peak, the stranger signaled for them to stop. They had reached a ridge overlooking a wide valley. "This is where we cross," he said, pointing toward the distant hills. The woman looked over the edge, her heart sinking. The valley was wide, open, and there was nowhere to hide. She could see the terrain stretching out for miles, the land completely exposed. If the outlaws were coming, They would have to cross this open ground. It was the most vulnerable position they had been in since the beginning. "Are you sure this is the right place?" she asked, her voice tight with concern. The stranger nodded. "We don't have a choice. It's the fastest way to the settlement." The woman swallowed hard. She knew he was right, but the thought of crossing that open ground filled her with dread. If the outlaws were anywhere near, this would be the worst place to be. But they had no choice. They had to keep moving. The stranger turned to the others, nodding for them to follow. "Stay close," he said, "and keep your heads down." They began their descent into the valley, and the woman couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking straight into the jaws of danger. The outlaws were still out there, and this was their chance to finish what they had started. They moved swiftly, their footsteps quick and silent as they crossed the open valley. The woman kept her head down, her eyes focused on the ground ahead of her, trying to stay as low as possible. The wind howled through the valley, but it was the silence that felt most dangerous. Every step seemed to echo, amplifying her fears. The stranger was ahead of her, moving with the precision and calm of someone who had seen too many battles to be unnerved. She followed him closely, trusting him with her life, though her heart pounded in her chest. The other men kept to the rear, their eyes scanning the horizon, alert to any movement that might signal danger. They were exposed here, vulnerable in a way they hadn't been before. She felt the weight of every footfall as if the earth itself was conspiring against them. The outlaws could be anywhere, just beyond the line of sight, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Every few steps, she glanced over her shoulder, hoping for the illusion of safety, but the wide expanse of the valley seemed to stretch on forever. Her mind raced with thoughts of what would happen if the outlaws caught up. What if she couldn't run fast enough? What if the stranger couldn't protect them all? The thought of being captured again, of facing the same brutality she had escaped, made her stomach twist. But she had no time for those thoughts. The stranger had said they were almost there, and she had to trust him. The valley was wide, and they had crossed half of it with no sign of pursuit, but the woman couldn't shake the feeling that danger was closing in. The silence was too perfect, too still. Then, she heard it, hooves in the distance. The unmistakable sound of horses charging, growing louder by the second. The outlaws had found them. Panic surged through her as she glanced ahead. The stranger didn't slow his pace. He didn't even flinch. His eyes were fixed straight ahead, determined. He was leading them toward safety, toward the settlement. They had to make it there, or they wouldn't make it at all. The hooves were growing louder, and the woman felt a surge of terror in her chest. She couldn't outrun them, not on this open ground. Her legs were already aching from the hours of running, and she knew the outlaws were faster. "Run!" the stranger shouted suddenly, his voice filled with urgency. "Don't stop until you reach the shelter." Without a second thought, she sprinted forward, pushing her body to its limits. The wind whipped past her, and the sound of the hooves grew deafening, but she didn't dare look back. Her lungs burned, but the adrenaline coursing through her kept her moving. The shelter wasn't far now. She could see it in the distance, a small cabin nestled against the rising hills. The outlaws were behind them, but the stranger had given them a chance. She couldn't waste it. She could hear the shouts of the men now, the outlaws closing in on them. They had only moments left before the fight would begin. Her legs felt like they were made of lead, each step more difficult than the last, but she couldn't stop. The cabin was so close. She could almost see the shelter of its walls. The stranger's warning echoed in her mind. "Run, don't stop." She didn't dare slow down. She pushed harder, her breath ragged, her body screaming in protest. Then, as she reached the edge of the shelter, a gunshot rang out behind her. She didn't look back, but the sound of the bullet hitting the ground so close made her heart jump into her throat. She dove into the cabin, the door slamming behind her as she stumbled inside, gasping for air. The stranger was already there, his rifle raised, his eyes scanning the surroundings. "Get inside," he said, his voice calm but urgent. "Now." The woman didn't hesitate. She crawled into the cabin and pressed herself against the wall, her heart racing. She could hear the outlaws' voices getting closer, the sound of their boots pounding against the ground, the anticipation of the final confrontation building with each passing second. "They'll try to break in," the stranger muttered, his voice grim. "We can't hold them off forever." She looked at him, fear flooding her chest again. The shelter was small, and there was no way to defend it from an all-out assault. The door was the only way in, and if they tried to breach it, they were done. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice shaky. "We fight," he said simply, his eyes meeting hers with the calm determination she had seen in him before. "We fight for our lives." The woman didn't know if she could do it. She wasn't a fighter. She didn't have the strength or the skills to take on the outlaws. But as the voices outside grew louder, something inside her shifted. She wasn't going to die here. She wasn't going to let them win. She gripped the rifle the stranger had given her earlier, her hands trembling as she checked the chamber. She had never fired a gun before, but now wasn't the time for hesitation. They were about to be overwhelmed. She had no choice but to fight. The outlaws reached the door, and the woman's breath caught in her throat. This was it. The stranger was already in position, ready for the fight, but the woman could feel the fear rising in her chest. But as the first outlaw slammed into the door, the woman made her decision. She wasn't going to die today. She raised the rifle and fired. The shot rang out, echoing in the small cabin, but she didn't wait to see if it hit. She moved quickly, taking cover beside the stranger as the door splintered from the force of the impact. The fight for survival had begun.